I'm going to begin this big research presentation. This first section is probably 25 minutes. And like I said, it covers basic research skills. And before I get started, I'll mention a few more things. And the first is to name that genealogy research in general really puts the heteropatriarchal nature of our history right in your face. The records that we look at are often centered around male heads of households and male surnames and heterosexual couples and nuclear families, and the gender binary is heavily enforced. And all of that is really present, right? And despite all of that, we can still get some really liberatory knowledge from this pursuit. And so we can hold all of that together. And I'll also note that, as one participant talked about, this work is inherently harder for Black people who are descendants of those who were enslaved, because of how families were constantly split up and how enslaved people didn't have their names even recorded on federal censuses ever throughout our history, until liberation, or until 1870. And so it's important to acknowledge that as we start, just so that we're aware that many of our processes of interacting with this subject are not the same as everyone else's. This training will also be US centric, simply because that's where my own research skills lie. And there will be definitely points of crossover with folks who are international or recently international participants. But there just may be a little extra translating to do for your context. And my hope is that this can also just be a jumping off point for you to find other skills as needed, and that will feel less overwhelming. I'll be sharing research skills of many different kinds, and even though they can be useful to you no matter how you are doing ancestry research, some of them will involve ancestry.com. And just because that's something I've used a whole lot in the past. And ancestry.com, is a corporation with questionable financial ties. And I'll mention that you can get an account with a 14-day free trial. And after that, there are like monthly paid subscription plans. And you are able to actually often focus your research on in 1 or 2 month chunks, and then pause your subscription so that you're not just paying for this like a cell phone bill. But there is also and I'll also say that with Ancestry, you can download documents that you create and that you work with so that you have things offline. I also know that during the pandemic, many public libraries also, it looks like someone actually is mentioning this in the chat right now, but many public libraries created free access to ancestry.com for members. I don't know how long that has continued, but I assume it's still happening in many places. It looks like I said, check the chat for some more information on that. Another place that you can do genealogy research is a platform called familysearch.org. That is actually totally free, I believe, and it's very similar to ancestry.com. Ancestry might have slightly better functionality, but this still seems like a pretty good option. And I think Dina told me that it sometimes has even better international records than ancestry.com does. And it seems like pretty much everything that I'm going to share about ancestry.com directly translates to that platform as well. Okay. Now I'm going to open my presentation. All right, so we're going to begin with this section, the basics of research. And so this is my family tree, right? And I've whited out the names of my parents and grandparents simply because a lot of folks get access to this, and probably not necessary, but there are just a lot of white nationalist types out there in the world online trying to dox people who do any kind of anti-racist work. And so thought I might as well keep family members private in this case. But this is my family tree. Many of these lines extend further back past this based on research I've done. But what is pictured here extends through my great great grandparents. And the first thing we are going to talk about is hints. And hints are original documents that Ancestry.com auto searches on all these people in your tree. And they are symbolized by this little green leaf next to these different profiles. And hints are really cool because you can learn a lot about certain people in your family without looking too hard. And there are hints of all kinds. There are death certificates, there are phone book listings, there are property records, church records, wills, passenger lists on ships, and more. And you'll need to look at them to determine whether they actually apply to the ancestor that it's tied to. But Ancestry.com and Family Search both pull things that have a decent likelihood of applying. The most important, and like I said, I saw someone just raise their hand, but we'll have time for Q&A right after this section where you can ask some questions about these processes. And I also might create a document where we can all kind of do like a Google Doc where we can do some like Q&A together, and even participants can answer participants' questions. And I might create that and send that out to you a little after this. The most important thing when you're doing genealogy research that a lot of people don't do, especially on Ancestry.com, is substantiate. And substantiate means proving the connection between one generation and the next with an original document. And one of the this is important to do in general, but one time this is really important is when you're drawing from other people's research, because this hints function allows you, sometimes some of the hints are access to other people's family trees who have crossover between you and them. And sometimes that's really helpful, but occasionally it's also wrong. And so you've got to substantiate and make sure that they have original documents tying one generation to the next. And when they don't, you've got to find one. And the easiest way to substantiate your tree is with censuses. And censuses are something that we're going to focus on a lot right now. And working with censuses is one of the most foundational skills in all of this. And I'm now going to show you an example of a census, of working with a census involving my great grandmother, who is named Helen Dixon Beale, who you can see right here toward the top of this chart in the middle. And we're going to try to find her parents, which I've also whited out, using census data. So I know you can't see my mouse here. I'm pretty sure you cannot, but pretend that we just click Helen's name right here, because when we click it on Ancestry.com, this would come up. And what this is just a little pop out given some of her information. The next thing we're going to do is click where it says 5 ancestry hints. We're going to see what those hints are. And this is the page that comes up, and there would be more hints listed here. But I just am showing you the first 2 here. This first one is some other people's family trees that you can look at and see what's going on with that. But what we're going to do is work with this 1900 census, US federal census. And what I'd like for you to do right now, feel free, a couple of you can call this out, but can someone unmute and call out, how old was my grandmother, my great grandmother Helen, in 1900 at the time of this census? How old should she have likely been?
4.
4, thanks. Yep. Yeah, so either 3 or 4, depending on the time of the year that the census was taken. So we click it, we click that link, And this is what comes up. And this is like a digitized pop out program to pull information from the written census document itself. You can also click view image and you'll see the actual document, but we'll get to that in a second. The first step when we're working with a census with on Helen Beale or on anyone is to make sure that is the right person. So to make sure this child is actually my great grandmother, and likely when we go into this looking up, maybe some of the first things we're searching are related to our grandparents or our great grandparents, and likely we'll have some information about them already. So we might know who their siblings are. We might know Helen's birth year, how old she is how old she is supposed to be at this time, like Sophie just said, 3 or 4. Um, and where the state she was born in. And if all of that checks out based on the census data, we can be pretty sure that this is my great grandmother. Step 2 is connecting her, now that we know it's her, to her parents and making sure that these people in this house are actually her parents. And the first way to do this is to look at the relation to head of house section. And so if we look at this here, it says daughter. So that is an indicator that it is like that Helen is most likely William's daughter. The next thing that we can do is we can click view image itself. There are also ways you can get these digitized information lists on, like I could get it for William or Emma too on this list. Sometimes that's easier to work with, but for right now, we're just going to click view image and we're going to go into this census. And this is what we've got. This might be a little hard for some people to see, but in the slideshow, you can zoom in on it later if you're interested. But this is the actual census. It looks pretty cool in some ways to see an old document like this. And another thing we can do to verify whether Helen is the child of these people, of William and Emma, is to look at the years married of William and Emma. Because there's a possibility that Helen could be William's child from a previous marriage or a previous relationship. But when we look here, it's hard to see, but if you look at one of the first 6 or 7 columns next to William and next to Emma, there's a number 8 there. And that is under the column of number of years married. So we know they've been married 8 years. We know that Helen is 3 when the census was taken. And so that's another thing and showing that this is, very likely both of their child. And that's enough for us right now to substantiate this connection. While we're here, I'm also just going to point out a few other interesting things about censuses in general, because censuses can not only teach us about tracing generations back or that like vertical ancestry research, but they can also do horizontal ancestry research, right? They can also just show us more details about individual people's lives. And when we look closely at them, there's a lot of really cool stuff. We can see to the right of the category where we see years married, we can see, looking at William, for example, we can see place of birth of this person, Missouri. We can keep going and we can see place of birth of the father of this person, Indiana. Same thing, place of birth of the mother of this person, Indiana, for William. For Emma, it's right, Maryland and Wisconsin. That might say Wisconsin, but I'm not 100% sure. We keep going to the right. We see the occupation, bookkeeper, for William. We keep going and we see that he rented. We see that the yeses right there. That means he can read and write. We keep going. We see an R. That means he rented his home. He didn't own it. And we keep going. And the H means he lived in a house rather than on a farmstead. The other thing I'll say is that for people with ancestors who immigrated in the early 1900s or late 1800s from a lot of times Central, Southern, Eastern Europe, to me, there's a lot of really cool information that you can find on those censuses from those time periods, including um, where they were born in Europe, including their native language a lot of the time. And, that sometimes can get pretty specific, right? So for my partner who has some ancestry in Eastern Europe, the country listed at the time of like in 1900, 1910 or something like that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Because that was what was in place there. That is now all these Eastern European countries. But the languages for her ancestors were Slovak and Magyar. Magyar essentially means Hungarian. So you can tell these specific ethnic groups that they were a part of based on those specific languages. You can also see, the factory jobs they had in US cities in the early 1900s and things like that. So if they spoke English or not. Interesting stuff. Um, but back to our process of tracing these lines back in time for my family, the next step in our process, once we are like, okay, William and Emma are Helen's parents, and therefore they are my great great grandparents, there's going to be a button that you'll see that says something like accept this source. And you click that. Um, and then what will happen is this information for William and Emma and even the siblings will all just like plug in automatically and get digitized into your family tree. And this will create new profiles in the tree for these parents, right? So when we look at this for Helen's parents, after we accept the source, it's going to say William F. Beal and Emma Beal, right? Um, And once we have that, we can start the process of tracing their ancestry to find their parents. And we basically go through the same process. So, number one, we check hints to think about for William, for example, we check hints to find a census of when that person was a child. Because when they're a child, they're likely in a household with their parents. Not always, which we have to verify, but that is common. And so we look in hints. Hopefully we can find a census from hints where this person is a child. So William was born in 1868, I believe, which means we're looking for an 1870 or 1880 census. If we don't see one in hints itself, we can also search for one ourselves. And the first way we can do that is from here. So when you click their profile and you see this thing that says search. So you can either click that, or when you're in their profile, you can click search in the top right-hand corner. And what that does is it generates even more documents that might be about this person, right? Um, the hints are like the ones that the algorithm thinks are especially likely, but when you click search, you'll find things that are somewhat likely too. And I've found census documents and I've verified them that have been accurate from that as well. Also, if you don't find anything there, you can literally go to Google. This is how I usually do it. There's probably a better way, but you can go to Google and you can type in ancestry.com 1910 census search, or sorry, in this case for William, 1870 or 1880 census search. Then you can type in his information that on the census, where on the search engine, where he lived, his age, his name, and sometimes you find it that way too. But once you find a census that you're considering, right, number one, you have to make sure that this is the person on the census, that it's the right person, checking with all known info, and then making sure that they are the child of the parents of the household. Um, by doing the same things that we just talked about that you can see here. But for Emma, right, there's another step because of the patriarchal nature of our history and our records. We only currently have Emma's married name, Emma Beal. We don't have her maiden name, and since that was the name she had when she was a kid, we probably need to know that to get a document on her as a kid and verify it. And so the way we look for that is we look for a marriage certificate, and marriage certificates are also really common um, in hints. It's one of the most common things in hints. And so this is what it looks like when I found Emma's marriage certificate, and we find that her maiden name is Dixon. And it's really important to then accept this source and then go back and actually in Emma's profile change the name to Dixon. Change the last name to Dixon, because then that is what will be searched for in hints and things like that. And that's the name you need to be able to really trace her back in time. All right. And so, yes, census research is like one of the most foundational skills in ancestry research. But there is some important info we need to know about it, especially when we keep going back in time in a US context. The first US federal census was in 1790, and they've done it every 10 years since. In 1890, census records were actually destroyed in a fire. So that's why you may not find them. Most of them were destroyed in a fire, apparently, which is amazing that there are that many census records in one place that they could all burn in a fire. But I guess they store them all in the same place. But so that's why you probably won't find them in hints on there very often. Before 1880, censuses do often not have a relation to head of household field, which means you're going to have to sometimes use other documents to double check to make sure that that the parents are the parents of the child you're looking at. And when we get to pre-1850, censuses get even harder to work with, and because they only list the male head of household, and all other household members are listed simply as tallies or numbers based in boxes based on age and gender. And so what that means is, right, like each of these columns here has a label at the top of it that says things like women ages 40 to 49, or women ages 30 to or 30 to 40, or whatever it is. It's usually 10 or so year chunks. Males ages 0 to 9, things like that. And the way that we work with this, if you want to go down this road, and I've only done it a few times, and I'm also including a link to an instructional video on this that'll be linked in the slides, which you'll get access to because this is a little complicated. But this is how you can work with pre-1850 censuses, right? So let's say there's a family, parents and kids, and the kids are now adults, the parents are older, and that all is the case in 1850. But you know that they likely all lived together earlier in time, when the kids were kids. And so you got 1850 census information on all these people, and you make this spreadsheet where on the left side you put their names and birth year. I would actually add the place of birth to this spreadsheet. And then you go on the right side of the spreadsheet and you list their ages on the 1850 census. And then without looking at any other documents, you just start filling out your chart on like how old they would likely be in each of these census years. And what this can do is you can then go to look at, the 1810 census. You can look at where maybe Sally and John were born, because you already know that. And you can go to that area because maybe they're still there because they were born only 5 or 6 years before. You can go to that area and you can look up families with this information, right? And you can look for someone named Stephen in this place with the last name that he has. It's not on this sheet, but and look for, and then you know like what the household composition is at that time, so you can try to find a household that resembles that. Make sure there aren't multiple households that resemble that or resemble something similar to that, because then you're going to need to do some more substantiation. But this is something that people have done, and genealogists do, and can be a skill that can work. But there are also many other types of documents to look for that can also help us both trace vertically back in time and horizontally to learn more about individual people. Death certificates are really helpful. They actually have a ton of information on them about an individual, um, including like the maiden name of that person's mother is a lot of times on there, which can help a lot for research. um, County and local histories in um, in 1876, right, like 100 years after independence, or the Declaration of Independence, they did all this stuff where they wrote all these genealogical histories of counties in the US that a lot of times go back through the early 1700s. And those come up on ancestry.com a fair amount and can be something to refer to that can tell you a lot. Marriage records we talked about, military pension files can have important information. Church records, sometimes pre 1850, as well as in general, have lots of information that ties kids to parents, that says birth years, death years, marriage years, things like that. And then wills and probate records, right, like passing property to different people, can show relationships between family members. um, and the last thing I'll say in this section is that, if you ever hit a roadblock in your research, sometimes I'm just on ancestry.com a lot, and I'm just like, my brain gets fried and I just don't know what to do next. Taking a break can help a lot, honestly. And then you can come back, and a lot of times like you get a reset, and you get inspiration to look down another path, and you start finding things that you didn't find when you were fried earlier. Um, Another thing is that if you ever hit a roadblock with like a certain type of research, or like how to find a certain type of thing, YouTube is a really great resource. And there are lots of people, professional genealogists with short YouTube videos on specific research skills.